You might not know this from the recent peace negotiations, but the majority of Americans still support Ukraine. They want to send weapons to help them fight Russia, and a pretty shocking 74% support creating and policing a buffer zone between Ukraine and Russia, backed by European ground troops and American air power. So let's get into it. Now, this is coming from the Reagan National Defense Survey. It's a survey they conduct twice a year. We've cited it in previous videos. I'll have it linked in the description below. In this one specifically, they talked to 2,507 U.S. adults. And starting out here, they noted an all-time high support for sending U.S. weapons to Ukraine. The question, overall, do you support or oppose sending U.S. weapons to Ukraine? 64% supported. The highest previous to this was back in June and November of 2023, where 59% were in support. And it's actually the lowest number that opposes at 26%. Previous low, again, back in June and November of 23 at 30%. A key note here is they don't differentiate between the U.S. donating weapons to Ukraine or selling weapons to Ukraine or Europe. So keep that in mind. I have a feeling that if we said, do you support selling U.S. weapons for Ukraine to use, that number might be even higher. Now, continuing with a couple of the key takeaways from this survey, the higher level question here, who do you want to win the war between Russia and Ukraine? 62% say Ukraine, only 11% say Russia, 26% neither, don't know. Key differences there from May of 2024. 4% increase in those Americans wanting Ukraine to win and a 4% decrease of those wanting Russia to win. Now, they did get into some pretty interesting specifics here where they talked about different policy proposals as to how the war will end or even things the United States should do going forward. Starting at the top here, and the question was, would you support or oppose each of the following proposals related to U.S. commitments to Ukraine? 74% support, so either strongly support or somewhat support, the creation of an international force to police a demilitarized zone between Ukraine and Russia, consisting of European ground troops backed by U.S. air power. I don't think I've seen that specific question asked before, but this is hands down the largest number of Americans that I have ever seen support the commitment of U.S. forces to anything to do with Ukraine. Generally speaking, in the past, I've seen questions, do you support U.S. ground troops in Ukraine or even U.S. air power to, enforce a no-fly zone? Generally speaking, those have been around 25, 30% at the highest. But here, talking about an end to the war, a buffer zone, Americans understand that you can't just say it and it's true. The effective enforcement of any sort of peace treaty here requires not just troops on the ground, which in this case would be European troops, and for what it's worth, that's what all of the agreements have said so far, but Americans seem on board with helping ensure that peace with American aircraft overhead. 69% supported providing Ukraine with a collective defense commitment, obligating the United States and European allies to respond with force if Ukraine is attacked again, like the U.S. commitment to NATO members. That's pretty high as well. 7 out of 10 Americans supporting a collective defense treaty for Ukraine. 68% support shifting the financial burden of the war by selling American-made weapons to European allies who would then be providing these weapons to Ukraine. That's already kind of the case we're in right now. If you look at the volume of weapons sent to Ukraine and money sent to Ukraine to purchase any of this, it is way down for the United States and way up for Europe just in the past 6 months. So we're already kind of there. And then more specifically, 65% said they support sending long-range cruise missiles like Tomahawks to Ukraine, giving them the ability to strike inside of Russian territory. This has all been pretty consistent. When you ask the American people who they support one over the other, it has been Ukraine from day one. And the American people, by and large, well over 50% throughout the entirety of this war, support the United States doing what we can to ensure that Ukraine can survive and possibly even win this war. You might not get that from the way these peace negotiations have played out. In fact, as a bit of an update there, it sounds like Putin, to nobody's surprise at all, just shot down the most recent round of negotiations. The BBC is reporting, quote, President Putin has warned again that Ukrainian troops must withdraw from Ukraine's eastern Donbas region or Russia will seize it. rejecting any compromise over how to end the war in Ukraine. Quote, either we liberate these territories by force or Ukrainian troops will leave these territories, he told India today. They say Putin's senior foreign policy advisor and key negotiator, Yuri Yushkov, earlier said straight after the talks that they produced no compromise on ending the war. Should not come as a major shock to anybody that this has all been for nothing. I mean, we saw this the moment this began a couple weeks ago when President Trump laid out that 28-point peace plan, and more on that here in a minute, and said Ukraine had a couple days to accept. And the next thing you know, it was looping the Russians in, and the talks had begun once more. And just as has happened time and time and time again, we see Ukraine trying and talking and making themselves available and meeting with U.S. diplomats and trying to find some sort of middle ground. My understanding is they're even talking today. And Russia says no. That's been a theme. At what point do we recognize that one of the parties involved here is not interested in negotiated settlement at all? I mean, they say it outright, okay? In fact, what we are seeing right now might be a little bit of what Katerina Lusanova mentioned in an interview we had last week. She works for Razum for Ukraine, and we did an interview on the kind of status of the peace process. And I said, what do you think happens next? And she said, in so many words, you might see the United States flip back to more of a pro-Ukraine, pressuring Russia type stance, which she said, look, it sounds crazy right now because that's really not where we are. But if you go off of how these talks have gone in the past, that is next in the roller coaster ride. And she might have nailed it. So overnight, Steve Witkoff issued a statement where he said a lot of things, but the key component here, quote, the American and Ukrainians agreed on the framework of a security arrangement and discussed necessary deterrence capabilities to sustain a lasting peace. Both parties agreed that real progress toward any agreement depends on Russia's readiness to show serious commitment to long-term peace, including steps towards de-escalation and the cessation of killings. So I think this is where we probably should have begun a long time ago, saying, hey, Russia, how about a little bit of some evidence that you're actually interested in negotiating a settlement? But after the back and forth, up and down, sideways of the last few weeks, we appear to be right back there. Now, Europe is still pretty much on edge here. I'm worried that there might be a lot of trust being lost that may not be recoverable between the United States and our European allies. Before diving into that, a quick fundraiser update. We did it. We hit the goal after, I want to say, about 5 weeks. $107,000 raised through Zynga's Paw for the Achilles Unmanned Systems Regiment. These guys are picking up long-range drone interceptors to bring down the Shahed or ISR-style drones. Awesome. This is incredible. You guys are always so incredibly generous when we put these together. And I think a reasonable ask for the Achilles people is, once you get these interceptors, can you share some footage of the drones that we helped purchase shooting down Russian Shaheds? I feel like that's a fair ask. So we're going to send that one over to the Zynga's Paw folks. But anyways, thank you again so much. Incredible generosity. So humbled at how kind all of you are when it comes to these fundraisers. Now, turning over to how Europe has been receiving some of these peace negotiations in recent days. Not well is probably the best way to put it. Der Spiegel, a German publication, published what they said was a transcript of a call between a bunch of European leaders after the 28-point peace plan came out a couple weeks ago. And they have French President Emmanuel Macron saying, quote, there is a possibility that the United States will betray Ukraine on the issue of territory without clarity on security guarantees, adding, quote, there's a great danger for Zelensky. They said the details of the phone call, which took place Monday and involved Macron, German Chancellor Merz, NATO Secretary General Rutte, Finnish President Stubb, Ukrainian President Zelensky, and others, were published in Der Spiegel and saw the leaders discussing the U.S.-led peace negotiations between Kyiv and Moscow. They had German Chancellor Merz chiming in that Zelensky had to be, quote, extremely careful in the coming days. Finland's Stubb seemed to agree with Merz, according to the transcript, quote, we cannot leave Ukraine and Vladimir alone with these guys, apparently referring to Witkoff and Kushner. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte chimed in saying, quote, I agree with Alexander. We must protect Zelensky. Now, Macron has since come out and denied this. My understanding is these were not audio recordings. It was the published transcript, the written transcript. Macron, just a couple days ago, responded by saying, I deny everything, adding that unity between Americans and Europeans on the Ukrainian issue is essential. And I say it again and again, we need to work together. But we've all seen it. There is a clear rift emerging between the United States and our European allies. it's been there for a while, and it's definitely, from my opinion, it's getting worse. In fact, it sounds like the United States is preparing to step back in terms of NATO leadership, is probably the right way to put it. Reuters issued a report yesterday where they say the United States wants Europe to take over most of NATO's conventional defense capabilities, from intelligence to missiles, by 2027. Pentagon officials told diplomats in Washington this week a short deadline that some European officials found unrealistic. U.S. officials told their counterparts that if Europe fails to meet the deadline, the U.S. could stop participating in some NATO defense coordination mechanisms, said the sources who requested anonymity to discuss private conversations. They added that there is no clarity on how NATO's progress will be measured. Now, let's not jump too quickly on this because there's a lot of gray area here. First off, it has not been issued in any sort of official arrangement between senior leaders of countries. This is all anonymous sources at this point. It does kind of track with some other statements we have here from Christopher Landau that came out this morning after meeting in Brussels. He's the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State. But there's a lot of different ways that Europe can, quote, take over NATO's conventional defense capabilities. Some of those would be realistic, hard, but realistic. Others are unreasonable for that short a period of time. Like if we were to say that NATO needed to 3x the size of their standing military forces, that's not attainable by 2027. So we'll see what those actual asks are, if it's true, and then how NATO will measure it. But kind of adding to that, Christopher Landau, again, the Deputy Secretary of State, is just back from the NATO ministerial in Brussels. And he put out some pretty scathing comments directed at Europe as a whole, where he said, quote, "My recent trip to Brussels for the NATO ministerial meeting left me with one overriding impression. The U.S. has long failed to address the glaring inconsistency between its relations with NATO and the EU. These are almost all the same countries in both organizations. When these countries wear their NATO hats, they insist that transatlantic cooperation is the cornerstone of our mutual security. But when these countries wear their EU hats, they pursue all sorts of agendas that are often utterly averse to U.S. interests and security, including censorship, economic suicide, climate fanaticism, open borders, disdain for national sovereignty, promotion of multilateral governance and taxation, support for communist Cuba, etc., etc. This inconsistency cannot continue. Either the great nations of Europe are our partners in protecting the Western civilization that we inherited from them, or they are not. But we cannot pretend that we are partners while these nations allow the EU's unelected, undemocratic, and unrepresentative bureaucracy in Brussels to pursue policies of civilizational suicide." Now, this doesn't exactly square with how the American people view NATO. Going back to the survey just released by the Reagan Foundation, they clocked attitudes towards NATO at an all-time high, at 68% viewing the alliance in a favorable light. Question being, do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of NATO? 68% being the highest favorable rating since they began tracking this in November of 2018. And they get into specifics here as well, talking about Article 5. You know, an attack on one is an attack on all, which is often something people view as kind of like the reason we should get out of NATO, is we don't want to be drawn into a war that is going to be fought, you know, between European nations. But they found that 3/4 of Americans support our Article 5 commitments, 76% in favor, with only 15% opposed. And then when you talk about leaving the alliance, again, a hot topic at times here in the United States, that support just isn't there across the American people, with only 34% supporting the United States withdrawing from NATO, with 59% opposing it. So this rather adversarial approach towards NATO right now, especially amidst these peace negotiations, is interesting. I think it's pretty safe to say that over the course of the last year now, we've been much more hostile towards some of our NATO allies and EU allies than we have Russia. Like, we have one-to-one comparisons here. You guys have heard me rant, I don't know how many times, about why are we not adding pressure to Russia? Why are we not making it harder for Russia to continue this war in Ukraine? And we tend to have the kid gloves with Russia. But when it comes to NATO countries, now, these are all just words, we should say that, but kind of going after them, saying we aren't allies anymore. This is not the alliance that we want to be a part of. There's a striking difference there. And kind of going back to the beginning of the video, I'm a bit concerned that we are going to create some rifts in this alliance that maybe can't be mended or can't be easily mended, or the nature of this alliance could be forever changed if we continue down the path we're on. Now, I wanted to save this article to the end because it's some speculation. It borders on fear-mongering. but I do think it also brings up some pretty interesting points about how the current status of these peace negotiations could very well lead multiple nations around the world to pursue nuclear weapons. And I don't think that's crazy. I think anytime you bring up nuclear weapons or more coming about, it does dabble a little bit into the or else and fear mongering. But the Wall Street Journal article here, I think, lays it out very well, where they say, as the Trump administration renews its search for peace in Ukraine, much of the commentary has centered on what Kyiv would have to give up in a peace deal. Far less attention has been paid to the global implications of the U.S. proposal, specifically how it would create an incentive for nuclear proliferation. The pressure on Ukraine to cede much of its territory will embolden non-nuclear states to consider developing their own nuclear arsenals. And I think this is something that in the United States we view probably not through the right lens, where it's, why on earth would you do that? That's too risky and that's stupid or expensive or whatever it might be. We've gotten kind of lazy, maybe complacent in the fact that there has been so little nuclear proliferation over the course of the last few decades. It's not out of the question. And what they cite here is multiple countries are starting to have that conversation again. They say, given the parallels with Ukraine and Russia, South Korea and Japan are considering whether they should have their own nuclear arsenals. Ross Anderson reports in The Atlantic that almost everyone he asked about the subject on a trip to South Korea mentioned Ukraine. Australia has likewise seen a swell of questions about America's reliability and whether Canberra should have its own nuclear weapons. So has Canada, which even has to consider a potential American expansionism. They say in Europe, long dormant debates around nuclear posture have emerged in Germany and Poland. And they wrap up by saying Poland was right not to trust Russia. But with America's sudden push for Ukraine to cede territory in return for an insecure peace, there are now questions about whether they should trust the Americans or whether the only thing they can trust in the face of nuclear imperialism is their own nuclear arsenal. I don't know that there's any indications that any countries right now are actually making that move, and it would be groundbreaking in a lot of ways, shattering a lot of norms on the international stage. But, one of the norms on the international stage is that the United States, through NATO, will be providing a sort of nuclear deterrent, a aggressive deterrent against, say, Russia, especially. And if these countries don't feel like that shield is still there, or that we are not going to back them up or abide by, say, Article 5, and it doesn't have to be a guarantee that we're not going to do it. If there's any doubt at all, you have to expect that these countries are going to do what they can to protect their sovereignty, protect their citizenry. One of those means very well might be nuclear weapons. Just something to keep in mind as kind of a unintentional side effect of how these peace negotiations are going between Russia and Ukraine. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.